Rickle Bones, a story in 3 parts by Ian Stewart. Rogue Bairns. Ellen stood ower the bodie o' a young lass, wearing canvas shoes wi' rubber soles. She'd round about the same sized feet. The lassie's hair floated in the river, and Ellen watched it get caught in the rocks, then wind its way louse. The lassie's face was all bashed in. Timo jabbed Ellen in the back.
Come on, we better hurry up.
He helped her pull off the shoes, and they ran back to the tunnels. They passed remains o' other rogue bairns that had lived indeed in the cove. Some they'd met at the edge o' a time, and some that had lived afore them. They'd nae fears 'cause they'd passed more heats and banes ever and on. Folk in Dundee didna fear a corp. What folk were afeard o' was the pain o' starving. No to eat was their dread. The bairns reached their den, and it was cosy. They'd managed to keep the fire going some weeks, 'cause they'd found an auld boozer up the hill toon, and they'd pulled plenty o' wood out for it. Carl had wanted to stay in the boozer, 'cause there was wa's and a roof. But Ellen said the hill toon was gangland. They were better down the docks, near the watchers and the boat-yeared workers, like her father had been. Some of the men still remembered Ellen was her father's bairn, and she felt safe by the river. Timo was already laying his finds for the wreck on the grund. Mere plastic bottles added to his collect. He'd been filling them with dirt to make a hurley bed to lift them off the flare at night. He'd hunted the river for plastic when the tide went out, and gathered buckets o' muck, then spreaded the dirt on the flare to dry by the fire. Some bits o' plastic Timo had hung with string, mak it for old rope for decoration. Ellen watched them shine like merry dancers, and felt grateful to her forebears for thinking to mak sic bonny things. Ellen picked a brush out the pile and ran it through her locks. Timo felt his ain head itch wi' peerie-weeries rinning ower his scalp. He could swap ane o' the women in toon a pair o' shears for that brush the morn, then cut all their hair back and get rid of the lice. Sometimes they biled pails and pails o' water and filled the barry, sat on planks for washing. Carl hated washing. Ellen liked it 'cause she pleated her hair after and I said she felt brand new. But Timo just liked no itching. Ane time he'd squeezed a beastie out his leg and it jamp, still alive. There was a holy scar on his leg after, and for days he'd keep it hame to bile a pail of water to clean it, till it started to scab. Now there's just a wee nook where the beastie used to be. That's where Timo likes running his finger when he's dreaming about things. Timo put ane of the tins on to heat, while Ellen dried wee Carl.
Did you see that man breathing?
Timo said.
There wasn't anybody breathing.
Ellen said. Then wee Carl piped up.
There wasn't many. I saw Iain move.
Ellen jumped up, then ran back through the tunnels and out. She heard the boys bawl after her, but she kept going till she reached the dock. She stood at the shore and listened for noise for the bodies, but there were hunters o' them, and the sound for machines droned loud in the distance. Water lapped over the blank faces o' the deed, shushin and shushin. She looked all round, till she saw motion near the skerry. Was it a near 'em? Ellen went to the bodies, passing over the ends without heeds. She crouched down, patted cloth shirts, and lay her hands on breasts till she felt ane of them rise and fall. Alive! How could anybody survive this water? This river used to get cod siller, but all she kent was it grey and mort cauld. Up in town lights blinkit fae houses, and she could hear the noise o' the pairty in the kirk, watchers playing whistles and banging the skin o' drums, and women singing lines fae songs when they were allowed.
Where my forefathers sleep, I cry for Scotia shores, and I gaze across the sea.
She tapped a beat on the Ootlin man's chest. What like would he be if he wakent? She searched at his jacket and found in his poke he was called Oliver Clark. She thocht it an ill name. Timo and Carl were lurking outside the cove too feart to follow her this time. The Ootlin still breathed, so she shifted his head to the side and rowed him, putting ane leg benon the other.
Ellen!
The boys wanted her back. They didna like her being out on her ain with the man living and watchers awack in the kirk, for they had rules, and rogue bairns were aye treated sairly if the pit a fit rang. She wondered what would come of the manny alive. Would he die on the rocks, or be found by the watchers? And what did they do wi' an Ootlin? There was talk o' folk up north biling neighbours alive for the taste, but they were savage places. It was unlawful to eat folk living, and there were enough corpse washed up here, so there was nae need. That would be greed grippitness. She held the Ootlin man's hand for a minute, and mak it a wish that he'd whack in time to run awa fae this place. Mary and the Ootlin. Her husband had telled Mary to feed and water the Ootlin. He was tied up, and she was just to leave a plate where he could reach it. Her husband had said,
"Dinna go near him."
but ane day Mary went down the cellar, and the stranger looked that weary, she kent he'd been greeting. Where he was tethered, the ropes had rubbed again his skin. He was bloody wi' wounds, and she felt hurt sair for him.
I can see you there.
The Ootlin had said,
"And to gie ye a bite to eat, will you no eat?"
So you can fatten me up.
Mary put the plate down where he could reach it. Then she climbed the stairs and fetched a bowl of water, a clute and some of that special cream she'd saved for when her bairn was born. She went down the cellar again. The stranger had turned his plate over, and all that good meat was on the ground. Mary turned the plate the richt way round and picked the food up in lumps with her hands.
Easy to see your folk haven't been starving lang.
We're starving, but we don't eat each other.
Soothmouthers have enjoyed their time in the sun.
Mary approached him. She kent if he attack it, she'd get worse for being so daft for her husband, but she wanted to clean his wounds. She kneeled aside him, then reached her hand out to lift his, and saw close how the ropes had bitten his flesh. She worked her way round, daubing the clute on his tethered joints. Then she washed his face. He looked almost a man.
"I ken you think I'm wicked,
She said as she spreaded the cream across his skin.
but I cannae help you. No any mair than the likes of this."
He nodded. Then as she was heaving up for the flare, he said,
I know you're not wicked.
So Mary sat down aside him again. And it ended up she let him curry in and fall asleep with his head on her lap. Later, when she travelled the stairs and lay down in her own bed, she began minding o' him, and thinking how soft his hair was atween her fingers, how lily his skin looked again his bones, how full of youth this strange lad was, compared to her own man, wi' his baldy head and grubby old flesh hanging off his face 'cause of the age o' him. It wasna long after that day that Mary gave the Ootlin a plate of food, and he grabbed at her hand.
And kissed it.
The Watcher. It was a November night when Iain found the bodies on the bank of the river. A heap o' puffy faces and frost-patched heads. A woman wa birthed while the boat was sinking lay face down on the rocks. Her blue-skinned bairn was attached by its cord and swayed back and forth on the waves trying to reach her. He picked the boy up, then rolled the mother ower and laid the bairn on her breast. No that it mattered. Among the deed, he saw some kind of motion. A limb that twitched, an eye that moved to meet his, a survivor. He reached out and pulled a man fae the water. The man breathed shallow, but Iain kent he was living. Dundonians or river folk were peaceful mostly, but it's nae land o' milk and honey. Even so, them fleeing war try to reach the Taes shores, but they wash up frozen. There'd never been a live ane until this man, a piece o' treasure. He thocht about Mary and the bairn in her belly, and he kent this stranger was a blessing. Iain lifted him fae the docks to town, and the man's trainer squeaked together o' the road. In the square he should have rung the bell so other men could come and deal with the bodies, bring twine and sacks. Had it been a normal night there would have been mair watchers, but that night Obdi was drinking 'cause of the shipment of vodka, so we waited afore ringing the bell, let them celebrate, and it bided him time till he got the man hame. Inside, he laid him out in front of Mary and they stripped him. She washed the salt fae his body and they dressed him in Ian's clothes. They heated the house and covered him with blankets. Mary lifted his head and tried to feed him broth, but the man's mouth was clamped shut, so she just rubbed his lips with a bit watery clute, so's he didn't die fae thirst. Mary and Iain sat at the table and watched the stranger. He was lang, built for walking, and he'd a colour of hair never seen afore. He looked round Mary's age, 25 or 26 maybe. The next day, Ian had to go down the smokehouse, but when he came home, Mary said the man was wakened. She said he was weird, 'cause he'd said words old-fashioned like a soothmoother. Ian said,
That's what happens when folk get separated 'cause of the elements. You forget what other words sound like.
That night they lay in bed and Mary told Ian what the man had spoken. How he'd paid to get on a raft with his sister's money, 'cause they'd heard up north there was meat for eating. Mary said,
He asked about his sister, but I didn't hae the heart to tell him what happens to the bodies.
the stranger had told her his sister's name, Lilith, and Mary said the word hour and hour, 'cause she liked the tune o' it in her mouth. He kent she felt sorry for the stranger, but it was hard for Ian to join in with her thinking, when all along he'd a plan in his mind o' what he'd do with him. They'd just in room, so the stranger had to go in the cellar, even though it was some part rotten wi' damp. Mary went down every day to feed the man, and weeks went by he started gaining strength. So Ian sent a message to Thomas Raibert, the most moneyed man in Dundee. There's a circle of folk that live in the west o' town. They come in their fancy gear the day after a wreck to buy the best cuts. That lot dinna wait for smoking. They want it fresh as it comes. Raibert visited at night. Mary hadna kent to expect him, and was surprised to greet a man like that in her hame. Her glower asked Ian questions, but she couldna say onything in front of Maester Raibert. You ken a moneyed man, 'cause there ends wi' shakes for eating brain. They think it's the best o' meat, but obdy kens it gies them disease. Mary gave Raibert a cup of vodka, and it was hard for them to watch his hand try to reach his mouth, and the spluttery way he supped.
Where is he?
Raibert asked. Ian pointed at the flare.
Thought you'd give him to yourself.
Was me wha found him.
That's no very community-minded. Do your neighbours ken you've meat to live?
Ian hawed at Raibert's stare, 'cause he believed then he was a man without much to lose. Raibert wiped his mouth with the back of his hand and his chair rattled. He looked round the room, then at Mary's belly.
But I'd do the same in your situation. You've done the right thing by coming to me. Much beef's on the bone.
Ian turned and saw Mary's face full of horror.
See yoursel.
He said.
I'll tak you down the now.
Ian took Raibert on her grund and Mary followed. The stranger stood in a corner. His muscles tightened, 'cause he was about to move. Raibert took a step closer and laid a hand on his shoulder to calm him. Then he stroked up and round the man's napper with shaky fingers.
Could say as he'd, but the body's no much pickings. Keep him just now and get word to me when there's more on him.
He reached in his coat and handed Ian a poke of money.
Feed him.
Mary gret, 'cause she understood now this stranger was a delicacy. But a deal was made with the our maester, and Ian kent to keep his end o' it. That night was the first they'd to tether the Ootlin. They lay in bed and listened to his cries beneath their heads. The next morning, Mary went to feed him and he flung the plate and retched at their dried meats. But some way, our days, she managed to calm him so he'd eat. Wi' no much violence on Ian's part, the mak at the stranger tame. When Ian was doing the smokehouse working, Mary would be speaking words with the man. Ian would come back and see them together, and he thought she was doing it for him, making a friend o' him, 'cause there was nae going back with Thomas Raibert. Weeks went by, and Mary's belly came to be filled with Ian's bairn. He noticed a change in her. She stopped looking him in the eye, and nights she didna like his hands on her. Then some o' her words came out like the stranger's. Southern. Ian noticed she was gieing the man things. She knitted socks for him fae wool that was meant for the bairn. She gave him an auld gansy o' Ian's, and he thought she must have been lichting fires in the cellar, 'cause the aches had been moved fae the hack block. But there was nae evidence in the essay bucket. Then came the night Ian was hame early, and she wasna happy he was back. He went down the stair and saw she'd loused the man's ropes, so's he could move about, and he was on the flaring exercise bigging his muscle. Ian wondered how long she'd been letting him do that, and why the stranger stayed when he could have easily broke free. Ian wondered about her and him, and all that time they'd been speaking. It was time to get him ta'en awa. Ian gave the man a dane with the taser. He tied his ropes, then came up and put his smart coat on for walking the west o' town. Mary said,
Why are you going in that?
It's time he went.
You're bringing Raibert the night.
Why'd you speak to him anyway? He's in Ootlin.
Mary ran downstairs and Ian went out. Then halfways up the street, he heard her bawl,
There was no need to hurt him, you!
Ian walked along Blackness to Raibert's house and was invited in by his man. Raibert was in the back room, looking out a windy at a rare bird, digging the starved earth.
It's been howking that bit anywhere.
Raibert said.
Must be some creature living underneath.
Ian stood in the lobby, no wanting to drag his muddy boots on the flare. Raibert turned and smiled, his wallies shifting in his mouth.
Your meat's ready then. We'll awa and get it now.
Outside stood Raibert's car and three o' his men. Ian was to go in the vehicle with him, and he'd a sinking in his belly, 'cause he aye hated sitting his ears in they things, believing a man should be stopping the grund in motion, no ensnared by machines. They travelled the Perth road, and all along Raibert twisted beads through his fingers and dragged religious words deep up for his throat.
St. Rock, pray for us that we may be preserved frae a' diseases, both body and soul.
When they arrived, Mary didna raise her een for Raibert or his men, but she gazed at Ian. The door to the cellar was wide open, and he kent then the Ootlin was gone. Ian went down the stair and saw the room empty. Raibert's feet clunked on the steps ahint him.
Your wife's a bonny woman, but she must be daft. She let you doon.
Raibert turned and climbed the stairs again, scunnered. Ian was shamed. Obdy kens there's only peace in Dundee 'cause of men like Raibert and his forebears. He believed his wife different fae him, but he hadn't imagined her foolish. Raibert would mak them pie. Ian looked round for a weapon, but he cleared Dathan when he brought the stranger in, and his taser was on its cleek. He heard Mary scream and ran up the steps, but Raibert's men grabbed him before he could reach her. He felt a shock o' heat through his body, then the widow the flare, his ribs, back, belly and head all dinged wi' pain. And Mary was thrashing about, Raibert's hands on her in violence. There was a breeze now, and Ian felt his head bump across the grund. He was outside, dragged the road, and when finally they stopped, he saw the smokehouse. Raibert rung the bell in the square, and folk came out their hames to look. Fear, but wanting to see. Fae the grund, Ian watched Raibert's men drag Mary inside. The debaga were her head and were tying twine round her legs. Together they strung her up and lit the pit fire. Ian's last sight o' her, she was hinging, strands o' her hair falling out fae a jute sack. Her belly and his bairn turned upside down, and her locket skimmering a reflection o' the flames. He got to crawling, but Raibert's man dealt him another blow, and he fell into a dwam. Ian started fae his sleep in the same spot of dirt outside the smokehouse. His teeth chattered and body ached when, by a licht o' the lamps, he saw Raibert and his men on the grund, lying by the pit fire, moaning 'cause the blood spewing fae hack wounds. And the eerie thing was, the rope Mary had been hanging fae had been cut down. Ian pulled himself up and hunted inside and out, but she was gone. He lifted Raibert's head.
Where is she?
Raibert pointed a shaky finger, and Ian saw a streak o' motion far awa'. The stranger, carrying a bundle that must have been his wife, travelling north. Raibert coughed 'cause the fume fae the pit fire was rising. Ian bolted the doors and let him and his men smoke to death. Then he followed, slow as he was, up the hill. 12 years have passed since the stranger visited. It's said that Ian has searched it back and forth the tract of land between Teelan Hill and Canool, over 100 times looking for his wife. The Sidla parishes have given him hope wi' their tails o' ronin family, wha eat nothing but meat fae rare birds. Folk say the bairn wi' them is a boy. Iain follows the smoke o' fires and pickings fae food left ahent, and he's found objects o' rags and buttons and things market. But the maist precious he found was his wife's locket, and he thought then he was the richt road.
Why did I cross the deep? Oh, why left I the land where my forefathers sleep? I cry for Scotia shores, and I gaze across the sea, but I cannae catch a glimpse